Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this week's presentation, xLights Gem Series. Tonight we're going to be talking about smart receivers and differential receivers and their configurations and setups in xLights with Ron Armstrong. With that, I will turn it over to you, Ron. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This week we were talking about potential subjects to present and prepare data on for these GEMS classes. And smart receivers seem to always be a complex topic that a lot of people seem to have some difficulty with. So I figured we'd just go over some basics. My intent today is to not get terribly technical, but enough technical to understand how they operate and not just click this button, click that button, but a little bit about how they operate. So then it might have those aha moments for some people, but try to stay that middle ground. I've got many friends in here that are watching. They'll keep me out of the technical weeds, I hope. So I appreciate that, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen and get my presentation rolling here. And I pretty much titled this as differential receivers. So the receivers that we use to extend ports on our controllers and to have more pixel connectivity uses a serial differential signaling. So differential receiver just kind of describes all of the receivers that connect that way that use that serial differential signal type. There are many different names that these receivers go by, so I'm going to try to use the vocabulary that I've come accustomed to and explain a little bit about the different names and such. Specifically tonight, we're going to be talking about receivers that go on that you are used to extend some of the standard controllers that we use in the hobby, such as controllers from Falcon, from Genius, and some FPP-based controllers, be they Culp controllers or Wally's controllers or Scott Nation controllers, whichever, but controllers that run the FPP software as their controller software. I'm going to comment real quickly about differential receivers for holiday Coro-based controllers, whether they be Hinks picks or Alpha picks. We're not going to cover those in great detail on this, but if people have a request for covering that in detail, make sure and let the xLights Gems teams know, and we can go into details on those as well. The receivers that are available are not cross-compatible between those two ecosystems. The Hinks picks and Alpha picks receivers use a different RJ45 cat cable connections than what the Falcon Genius and FPP do. They operate very similarly, but there are some differences, and we won't go into those differences too much. If you have a specific question, I'll do my best to answer, but we'll move on. So there's all types of receivers that are out there from over the last many years, different colors and flavors and versions, and depending on what controller you have and what version of which specific receiver, and sometimes which color it is, might, have this cross matrix of all these complexities on what setting do I use for this combination. And so we're going to go into some of the detail on that and the newer receivers, how they solved some of that. Um, I'm using the term differential receivers, sometimes called long range receivers, because there's kind of two key types, right? There's what we call smart receivers commonly. So smart receivers would typically have two RJ45 connections on the receivers for kind of like an input output so that you can daisy chain them and stack them together. And then like these other receivers on the bottom here might be a normal or a dumb receiver or a standard receiver. We use those terms interchangeably. Normal receiver, dumb receiver, standard receiver. They do not have the ability to daisy chain. We're going to go into some details here in another slide. And they usually only have one RJ45 jack in them because you're going to go from the controller to this receiver, and there's no ability to chain them together. So that's a quick, easy visual to see if you had just a normal dumb receiver or if you have a receiver that's capable of being a smart receiver. So how do these receivers work, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the data stream. That's the actual pixel data that goes from your controller to the lights. So for a normal, dumb, and standard receivers, I've got a representation drawing here on the left. Oops, with my mouse, sorry about that. We'll pretend that this square box on the left is your RJ45 cable that you're plugging into a controller, maybe a Falcon F16 V5, and you're plugging into the port labeled 17, 18, 19, 20. So your receiver, your models that you put on this receiver are going to be on those ports on your controller. An RJ45 cable has 8 wires in there, and there's going to be an orange pair, a green pair, a blue pair, and a brown pair of wires. And each port, the signal, the data stream for each port will go over one pair of wires. So port 17 will go over the orange pair of wires. Port 18 will go over the green pair. Port 19 will go over the blue pair. And port 20 will go over the brown pair. That's why our smart receivers have 4 ports. Since we use RJ45 cable to connect them, I'm able to get 4 signals to represent 4 ports. On a normal and dumb receiver, there's no daisy chaining possible we talked about before. There's typically going to be just a single a single receiver per each RJ45 cable from your controller, just as I've kind of drawn here. So there's no daisy chaining. And if applicable, there may be terminators on these. So you can use, technically you can use, and we normally would recommend if you're only going to do one receiver on that RJ45 cable and you're not going to daisy chain them, you can use a smart receiver in a normal mode. Notice this box of the data is white. Talk a little bit about that. And there's no pixel sharing, right? So each port on your receiver will have the maximum amount of pixels based upon the controller you're driving it with, right? Whether that's 800 pixels or 1,000 pixels or 704 pixels, depending on which. You have the full pixel count of your port available to you when you're only using a single receiver in normal mode. When using a smart receiver as a single by itself in normal mode, if there's terminators on that receiver, you need to configure the terminators as on to signify the end of the line. When we get into a little detail of all of the different versions of receivers here in a minute, we'll talk a bit more about those terminators. But at the end of the line, you're going to terminate, just like you're putting a cap on the end of a pipe to terminate the end of that pipe. The terminators go on the last item in the chain. And if he is the only item on the chain, the only receiver on the chain, he is the last and he is the end of the line. Okay, so a little bit about normal mode there. And if people do have questions, feel free. I saw a few things going into chat. I'm not sure if those are questions or not. And if you see questions as we go through, don't hesitate to interrupt me and
No, no
let me
questions
know.
yet. Keep going.
Yeah, perfect. So now how does that differ from when we start daisy chaining smart receivers? So when we daisy chain smart receivers, it's going to use a specific protocol in order to put receiver data on the same lines. So if I have multiple receivers, I'm daisy chaining them together, it's still one RJ45 jack on my controller. So in this case, 17, 18, 19, and 20. But the data on the data stream as it goes to the receiver will have a positional value, right? The A receiver will be in the first position. The data for the B receiver will be in the second position. The data for the C receiver will be in the third position. So when configuring multiple receivers, commonly we'll see people say, oh, I'm trying to configure port 17 through 20 for these models and port 21 through 24 for these other models. Well, that's just not how smart receivers work when you're daisy chaining them. When you're daisy chaining them, you'll have like 17 through 20A for the A receiver and 17 through 20B for the B receiver. To complicate matters a little bit, there are 3 different versions of that protocol used on these controller types. And so there's the Falcon V1 protocol type that was originated with the Falcon like 16 V3s and the original white Falcon F48 series of controllers. FPP does support that protocol as well. Then there's a Falcon version 2 version of the protocol and slightly different FPP version 2 of the protocol. So there's 3 different versions of Smart protocol depending on what controller type you're using. The Falcon V2, not to be confusing, but the Falcon V2 version of the protocol was released with the Falcon V4 series of controllers, and that's also used in V5. There's a slight variation of the protocol for V5. So you can daisy chain the smart ones when you have them together there. Again, about terminators, you want to turn the terminators on the last receiver in the chain at the end of the line. And your terminators, which are going to be little dip switches that we'll see in a minute, will be off on any receiver in the middle of the line. So I like to think about it, if my receiver has if the receiver side has just one RJ45 cable plugged into it, that's going to be the end of the line. If there are 2 RJ45 cables plugged into it, that's likely going to be the middle of the line, right? Because I'm going to have a signal coming in and a signal going out. So if there's 2 cables, you want to turn terminators off. If there's 1 cable, you want to turn terminators on. So when daisy chaining receivers together this way, because it's the same data stream, so port 17 data stream on that orange pair of wires goes to the first port on A and the first port on B and the first port on C. So when you're daisy chaining receivers, you start to share the maximum pixel count. So let's presume you have like a Colt K8 controller, and for 40 frames a second, if the maximum pixel count is 800 on a port, then the sum of the pixels on 17A plus 17B plus 17C cannot exceed that total pixel count. So you can see real quickly, the more receivers you chain together, the less dense you can have your pixels per port on those receivers. Point I want to really make out of this diagram is that each chain of receivers, and we refer to a chain as multiple receivers daisy chained together, each chain is still only 4 ports on your controller. You just have different data in different positions on that train. Think of it like train cars. You have different data in different train cars, and one train goes to A, one train goes to B, one train goes to C. That's kind of how I kind of think about it. Kind of trying to oversimplify the digital workings of how that works. So because of the combinations of versions and, oh, before we get to that, I apologize. I added this slide just a little bit ago. So when you're running receivers, there's a total length of cable run from controller to receivers you have to keep in mind, because that signal does degrade over distance. So for Falcon receiver types, whether it's an FPP controller or a Falcon controller or a Genius controller using Falcon receiver types, that length is around 300 foot. Some say 250, some say 300, from the controller to the last receiver in the chain. Now, an exception to that is on Genius receivers. One thing that makes them a little different is Genius receivers actually regenerate that data. So if you're using Genius receivers, whether it's on a Genius controller or a Falcon controller or an FPP controller, in this case, the controller doesn't matter, the receiver type does. The Genius receivers will regenerate that differential signal, that receiver signal. And so you can technically go about 300 feet between each receiver. So you can actually get a longer distance using Genius receivers because they regenerate that data so that doesn't get degraded over distance. That's one differential on Genius receivers versus some of the others. But because there's so many versions, and depending on what controller you have and what versions, and is it a white board or a black board or a red board or a blue board, and version 2.0 or 2.01, this chart was put together a couple years ago to help make sense of the complexity of what setting did you need to set with. And this chart is available on Wired Watts' website. And I'm gonna give full credit to Daryl C., great community member from down in Australia that started to put this data together. And then I joined him in that in that venture, and kind of refined it and added and retested all the different versions and kind of helped put this chart together. And we gave Ken at Wired Watts chance to, permission to go ahead and post this on his site. So as an example, if you go to Wired Watts website and go to like shop for controllers, you would go to Falcon controllers, this will be a list. Scroll down till you see receivers. When I choose one of the 4-port receivers and you come down to the product overview, it'll talk a little bit about what protocol. Could you lose some pixel count because of the smart protocol? And this is where this chart is available. So if you do happen to have older receivers that are like the V2 or the V201s, or even the really old version 1 receivers, this chart may still be handy for you. Like, oh, I'm using a BeagleBone cape with FPP. Basically, it's any kind of FPP-based controller. You know, can I do 3 in a row or 4 in what setting, or what dial setting, to determine the position in line? There is a method to determine the position in line, and whether you use like 4 through 9 or 1 through 3 or A through F or whatever setting, you're able to use this chart. Recognizing that this is quite complex, give much credit to the actual product developers, whether it's David Peace with xLights for the Genius series stuff, or he already did auto protocol detection. But all the new receivers do automatically protocol detection, so they will detect. So it's much easier if you have newer hardware. You don't have to worry about this chart. It's just it solves a lot of those headaches and those problems because it will automatically detect which protocol version your controller is sending. So the complexity of what setting to set is um, no longer a big concern unless you have some of these middle era receivers from several years ago. So let's talk about the versions of receivers, get a little bit more details here. So there's the version 1 of the receiver, commonly available in either a white or a black. Technically, in this version of receiver, these are some pictures of what those will look like. And these versions of receivers are technically the same. The one difference is the white one comes from Falcon. They're both designed by David Pitts at Falcon, but the white ones came from Falcon and use the same 4-port connector as the Falcon series controllers do. And the black ones were still designed by David Pitts at Falcon, but sold via Dan Culp at xLights. And the only technical difference between these is the 3-pin Phoenix connector versus the 4-pin Phoenix connector. So electronically the same. On the back of most of these smart receivers, there usually is a screen print for the mode switch to kind of give you an idea of how to set them. So in this version of 1, it uses the version 1 version of the protocol, and there's only 3 receivers allowed in a chain, right? You can have an A, B, or C. The mode is set with dip switches, as we see here, and there's a little chart on the back to indicate if I'm going to be in normal mode, if this is going to be the A position, the B position, or the C position. These receivers are supported on the Falcon V3 or within FPP if it's configured in xLights as a Falcon V1 protocol type. Touch base that when we get into the xLights section on how to change that on FPP based controllers. So let's move to the next generation where we have version 200 or 201. Those were available in either a blue directly from Pixel Controller and David Peets, or from black available through other sources like Wired Watts or Culp at xLights. The V2 introduced a new protocol and they can now do 6 receivers per chain, A through F. And there was technically a difference whether it's the blue board or the black board. And I've got a little picture here of the back print, screen printing on the back of the receivers. And you can see that on the black boards, we used 4 through 9 on the dial for if it's a Falcon controller. And on the blue boards, you used A through F if it was a Falcon controller. And these settings are just inverted. For the Falcon V4 used the Falcon V2 version of the protocol, and the Pi and BeagleBone and FPP based controllers use the FPP version 2 of the protocol. So you had to set the right dial indicator depending upon which controller type you had. And the settings, if it was a black board, are different than if it was a blue board. So this is where the confusion started really taking off and why we had to put together that compatibility matrix. The terminators are a dip switch, right? So this helps determine the last in line. The little picture here in the middle, there's 4 little dip switches. The terminator dip switches on all of our receivers that have them need to all 4 always be in the same position, right? All 4 dip switches turned on if it's the last in the line or one RJ45 cable, and all 4 terminators off if it's the middle of the line or 2 RJ45 cables. And then this is a little picture of the dial in the little dial selector to select your specific mode based upon the mode settings described either on the back of your receiver or within that chart that we were just talking about. Just use a little fine screwdriver. I will indicate that on these dials, there's one of these crosses that has an arrow at the end. And sometimes that's quite hard to see, especially if it's already built into a box. It's kind of hard to see what that arrow is. So one of my friends is in the room right now, Pat Delaney, had a great tip last night that you can take like a colored marker and mark that side of the dial to kind of highlight where the arrow is. And I didn't grab a picture of that when he was showing it to me last night. But that is just a great usability tip. If you have a hard time determining where the arrow is, once you find it, just take like a little black marker or a red marker or whatever you have and mark that side of that little rotator where the arrow is. And that way it'll be a little bit easier if you ever had to change that position. These version 2s are supported on Falcon V4, V5 type controllers, Genius controllers, or FPP controllers when configured as an FPP V2. So had all this complexity, the super matrix of what combination do I have and how do I configure it? So fast forward to the next version of receivers, and these are commonly from the Falcon design, which is sold by Pixel Controller, Wired Watch, Lights, and sold by many. So the Falcon design, they're all named SRX something. So SRX1, SRX2, SRX4. And right here, I'm going to talk about the version 4 of those receivers. So he jumped from version 2 of receivers to version 4 of receivers just to try to get version alignment with the Falcon controller version number. So what's new in the SRX series is they automatically detect the protocol. So we're going to suggest you always use A through F for A, B, C, D, E, F, no matter what your controller is. No more chart, no more getting out the magnifying glass and trying to figure out the secret decoder ring to figure out what combination you needed for your setup. There are still blue or black versions, whether they're sold directly from Pixel Controller or sold from other sources, and they still differ on some of these 1 through 3 or the 4 through 9 settings in case you had to hard specify which protocol, but we are always just going to recommend use A through F for auto detection of protocol, and that works very much all the time with modern firmware on all the controllers. So you have the same dial setting for determining the place in line, the same dial that we just talked about, and the same termination switches and termination rules, right? Terminators on, end of line, off, middle of line, and a little rotator dial to select your settings for A, B, C, D, E, F. So the current version that just released recently is now called SRX5. So there's some changes to that, right? So it still auto detects the protocol. Still want to use A through F for everything. The same dial for position A through F, and use the dial. One notable difference for the version 5 of your receivers are that the RJ45 jacks are marked as in and out. So the version 5 of the receivers introduced a bi-directional protocol because everything up to this point, it's like controllers sending data to the receivers, receivers outputting to pixels. Now there's a bi-directional part of that protocol where the receivers can talk back to the controller. So part of that new slight variant in the protocol, there's now an in and out. So make sure that when you're using the V5 receivers that you're plugging the RJ45 jack into the correct or the RJ45 cable into the correct RJ45 jack, whether you're coming from the controller to input on the receiver and then output to the receive from that receiver to the next receiver in the chain. That bidirectional communication helps, so the V5 receivers also have E fuses and introduces a current monitoring circuit on these receivers. So the status of the E fuses and the current monitoring can be returned back to the controller, and that is supported on Falcon V5 controllers and several of the latest version of Culp controllers. Originally, it was the Culp K16 V2 only, but you'll probably hear from Dan Culp in these Wednesday night gem sessions pretty soon coming up, and he's going to be talking about the new version of controllers that he has, the new variants that I am just calling the 2025 edition. Some of them I know came out in 24, but many of the new controllers should support that eFuse status report back to the controller as well.
That's next week, next Wednesday night, Ron.
Oh, it's actually next week. So perfect.
Yep.
Come back next Wednesday night, 8 Eastern, 7 Central, and you'll get to hear from Dan Culp of xLights on his
Or did I
new
get that
additions of
wrong?
controllers he has this year. And then we have the Genius receivers. So several different types and slightly different variations depending on the year. So they do all Genius receivers do automatic protocol detection. But another thing that differentiates them is they do auto place in line. So like we talked about earlier, when we we're talking about how the data is laid out in the cable length. So the Genius receivers will receive that data and take the first train car of data, the first position of data for the first receiver. Then it regenerates the data and sends that to the next receiver. Now the next receiver takes the first position of data, but it just happens to be the B data. And then it regenerates. So it's like take one down, pass it around. So it takes the first set of data for that first receiver, then it regenerates it then the next receiver gets the next. So they will always detect their place in line based upon how they're cabled together, A, B, C, etc. And their data jacks have always been marked as input and output, um, because of the way that they regenerate the data and send it to the next. They have to know which port is input and which port is output. The Genius receivers all have a polyfuse. The receivers themselves don't have like eFuses that I'm aware of. I don't know if there's a next generation coming. This top one is a 2025 edition. And so a polyfuse is just a self-resetting fuse. You can't manually turn them on and off and all, but if you do have some sort of a short or an overcurrent condition, it will that polyfuse will break the connection. And when that condition no longer exists, then it automatically resets. So you don't have to worry about replacing the blade fuses for those times when you're, messing around and accidentally short something out, like cutting a string of pixels while it's powered up. Ask me how I know. The only time I've ever blown a fuse is either my mistake or cutting pixels while they're powered up and, shorting them out. The Genius receivers do have quick connectors for pixel output. So the 2024 and earlier receivers have the spring-loaded connections. And then the 2025 version of the receivers moved to these quick lock kind of connections. So instead of the Phoenix connectors where the individual screw terminals, that's another thing that's different with the Genius receivers is they have these quick connectors for pixel output. So in all things versions, everything we've talked about so far is based, on the 4-port receivers, right? And you can daisy chain multiple of those together. Well, knowing that a lot of people have been using like multiple receivers in one spot, so you might build an enclosure box with 2 receivers in it or 3 receivers in it. So the manufacturers recognize that as a use case. So they started coming out with 8-port and 16-port receivers. Right. So at the bottom of this page, you'll see 2 different versions of the Falcon 8-port. This one on the left is one I actually have powered up for my live demo here in a little bit. We can show you how to configure and make lights go flashy blinky. And this one is a direct attached to power supply. So it directly attaches to the power supply is our 8-port SRX2. And then this is their traditional SRX2. And on the right side, the SRX4, which is a 16-port receiver, and then the Genius, which is a 16-port receiver. So the numbers like SRX1, SRX2, SRX4. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that that's the number of receivers that are on the one board. So these multi-port receivers are just multiple receivers built on the same board. So it's technically the exact same. So if I take an SRX2 that has 8 ports on it, it is 2 receivers on one board. You just don't have to wire the power supply differently, and you don't have to use a separate jumper cable like a RJ45 jumper cable. So you get 8 ports together, but it's technically is just 2 receivers. All the 16-port receivers are just 4 receivers on one board. So you don't magically get extra ports or anything. Each one of these receivers is still only 4 ports on your controller. It just divides the data like we talked about, where I have the A data and the B data at different positions in the data stream. So the Falcon receivers are marked as like in these pictures are not terribly clear, but that 16 port you can kind of see a little bit. So they're marked with like little white squares around every 4 ports. And they'll be marked like ID and ID plus 1, ID plus 2, and ID plus 3. Well, ID is what that dial set to. So for example, if you're going to use one of these 8-port receivers as the first in line from your controller, and you set your dial to A, then the 4 ports in the ID box are going to be A, and the ID plus 1 would be B. Let's say, 50 foot away, I have another one of those I'm going to daisy chain. And so I'll set his dial to C because I technically have A and B in the first 8-port. And then the second 8-port, if I'm daisy chaining, will be C and D. So I'd set that dial to C. So ID would equal C, and ID plus 1 would equal D. And same for the 4-port, or the SRX4 receivers that have 16 ports. Whatever you set the dial to is going to be that first box. So if you set it to A, then it would be A, B, C, D, all in on one board. The Genius are actually marked as receiver A, B, C, D because technically they determine their own position based upon their take the data, take it off and pass it down and that regeneration of data. So the 16-port receivers will pretty much always be an A, B, C, D on the Genius tank. Be very mindful of your pixel count when using these larger receivers. So if I'm doing a bunch of high definition props and I get a 16-port receiver, I may not be able to use all ports because you pretty rapidly, remember that's 4 receivers. So I got to take the first port in the ID box or receiver A box, for first port in receiver B, first port in receiver C, first port in receiver D. I add those all up. I might get to be higher than the 800 count or the 704 count that my controller would support. So when doing these larger based receivers, just be mindful that you won't be able to do a bunch of high definition props on them because you're going to run out of port count based upon how the data lays out in the stream. Especially on all your 16 port, version receivers, it's very easy to exceed that pixel count per port. Say my Ron Armstrong, not the general community recommendation, but the Ron Armstrong and the shows that I work on, I find that these 8-port receivers are a really great sweet spot because I might have an area that I really need more than 4 ports, but I don't quite need a full controller. If I need 16 ports in an area, I would likely deploy a full controller, an additional controller, instead of a 16-port receiver. So my personal opinion is I don't really use the 16-port receivers, but they're still a fantastic receiver. They're still great to use them, but just be mindful of their the shared pixel count because you might not be able to use all of the ports that you think you're going to be able to use. But 8-port receivers I find are a real sweet spot. 4 ports, obviously, anywhere I need a couple of ports in my distributed show, I need a couple ports here, a couple ports there. 4-port receivers. I got more props in this other area. I'll do an 8-port receiver. But those are just my personal opinions. Your mileage may vary depending on your needs. So that's a lot about the different versions and the details and looking at some of those. So let's kind of get into like, how do I make these things work, right? So let's get into xLights a little bit, right? So in xLights, we still highly recommend that, you use the auto layout methodology, which enables the visualizer, and you're going to use visualizer to drop models on your ports. And that's your virtual connection diagram on what's connected to what port. So you're going to add the model to the appropriate port visualizer. Let's say in this left example, I have these models on ports 21 through 24, and then you can right click on that model, select the smart remote from that menu, and then select A if that's going to be the A remote, and then your other model, and we're going to do this live here in just a minute. Your model for your B, you would then put on port 21 as well, and then right click smart remote B. So right click on the model, select smart remote, set the specific smart remote number that model is attached to, whether it's an ABC. And then if you are using a multi-string model, like a Mega Tree or a Grand Illusion or an EFL showstopper spinner, some of these high definition props that have multiple ports, then that multiple port spans receivers. Then you must right click on that model, go to smart remote, and then cascade down remotes and configure the number of remotes that you're cascading down. And again, we're going to show this live in a demo here in just a moment. So in the background, you can kind of see there, I've got like a 16 port mega tree configured with 200 pixels per port. And then I went right click and cascade down remotes 4, and the tree connections will go 1, 2, 3, 4 on the A, then 5, 6, 7, 8 on the B, then 9, 10, 11, 12 on the C, and then 13, 14, 15, 16 on the D. This is a use case where a 16-port smart remote might work out great for you, depending on the number of pixels per strand on your tree or per string on your tree. So as we talked about multiple protocols earlier in the V1 protocol and the different V2 protocols, with an FPP-based controller, such as a Culp controller or Wally's Lights or any of those FPP-based controllers, that some of them don't support differentials, but Culp controllers support differential receivers. You may need to set the smart remote type. So with again in the visualizer, you would then right click on the port number instead of the model. My recommendation, you can do it on the individual model, or you can do it on the port. The port will make this effective on all models on your receiver port chain that port's attached to. So you right click on the port number, you can set smart remote type. That's where you can pick whether you're the Falcon V1 or V2. That setting is not available on Genius controllers or Falcon controllers because the controllers themselves only output one protocol type. They do not have the capability to output different protocol types. So Falcon, again, the Falcon V1 protocol type is for the older legacy protocol that supports only 3 in a chain in those older receivers. And then the EPP V2 is what we would normally suggest you use, and it supports up to the 6 receivers per chain. If you have those old generation 1 smart receivers, like we showed in the beginning of the presentation, then you would have to set the V1 protocol. But the newer receivers support both the V1 protocol and the V2. We would recommend using the V2 protocol. And that's pretty much the end of my actual presentation. But now we're gonna go into like the live demo. And I thought I did this a moment ago, but evidently I didn't. Why is my change temporarily again not there? Anyway, so for those who've seen my classes before, I like to do live, and I got a little camera set up that I should be able to access, showing these little trees. Just to kind of level set this left tree, the standard NSR medium tree that lives here. This is on my A receiver, so that's technically, oops, excuse me, going to be port 1 on the A side of the receiver. And then the spiral X tree is going to be port 1 on the B side receiver. So the way I have this physically wired right now, I'm using this F16V5 with the F16V5 with a SRX2 8-port receiver that is direct PSU mounted. In fact, you can see it right down here in the bottom of this video. This is the receiver. Technically, don't pay attention to the messy lab, but this is a power supply with that receiver directly attached to it. Anyway, change this camera view back and just make that so that we're able to see the flashy blinky when we make it happen. So my layout, this controller is not actually used in this demonstration. So I got a 16V5 and I configured this K8 scroller so we can show the different protocols, right? From a layout perspective, I've got a big tree configured, 16 with 200 per output back and forth. So it's 32 strands, 16 controller ports, 200 nodes per string. And then I've got my little trees here represented in the layout. So my 16V5, I'm just going to clear everything and set this up for it. So remove smart remote and remove all models. So port 21 is where I have this picked up. So I've got tree left, which is my standard little guy. And then so I just drug that model over here on port 21. If I was only using a single receiver in normal mode, so if I leave the dial set to the default 0 position, so the 0 position is the normal mode on our dials, then I would just leave this white and leave it alone and just treat it as a regular port. But if I am going to daisy chain, which I'm in this demo, I would right click, smart remote, and I'd set that to smart remote A. So you'll note what that did is it changed the visual here in Visualizer. So now I have all these green boxes on ports 21, 2, 3, and 4. I'll also call your attention to the little colored line here on the left side of Visualizer, like this red, pink, yellow. That's just a line on every 4 ports. So when you get into your differential ports, you can see which ones are related to a particular chain. So you can tell pixel port 21, 22, 23, and 24 were all part of this chain. Port 17, 18, 19, and 20 would be part of a different chain or different RJ45 jack on the receiver or on the controller to connect to the receiver. So now I got my A here for my tree left. So I'm going to attach my star. So in this case, my tree's wired directly to my star. When I drag my models over here, notice what's blue. And then when I go right over the tree, you see I got a left half and a right half. So whatever is blue is where this model is going to get dropped. So if I come to the tree left and I go to the right side and drop it, I'm going to go right after it, right? So the fact that I dropped it right there within the green box, it automatically just says I'm already configured for A. I'm gonna take this single line and just drag it over into this. If I drag it over into the white port, you can see it did not configure it, and you'll see I've got an error down here that says, hey, I got an error, and this model's configured not on a smart remote, but this block of 4 ports has at least one smart remote. So don't drag it on the port, drag it within the green box, and it automatically configures it as A. So if I drag it within the boxes, the colored boxes, then it automatically configures it, and I do not need to hit smart remote on every single model. So I'm going to take my Spiral X, and I want to put him on port 21. So technically he's going to be on my B. So I can either drag it anywhere on one of these other models, or I can just drag it at the end. If I drag it at the end, it automatically kind of at this point added it into the A, but I know it's on B. So I'm going to go smart remote B. Boom. Now I got purple boxes. So the green boxes represent A as designated by the letter A in the corner, and then the purple boxes or the B is designated by the B. If I had a C, this just I messed up on my mouse. Sorry about that. Get rid of the single line. Get my tree left back on the A and my star left back on the A. My single line. I got a single line smart remote C if I had another receiver in that chain, and you see their boxes of different colors. So A, B, C, all the different receivers are represented in different color boxes. This is what I have connected here at ports 21 through 24 right now. So I want to go ahead and close the visualizer, save my configuration, upload outputs to the controller. So let's test, right? So my favorite tool in xLights is going to be Tools, Test. So after you do your configurations, love the testing ability from within xLights. So on the right-hand side, you have different test types. You know, what ABC would represent first channel, second channel, third channel. So I would cycle through, because I'm on the RGB cycle tab, that cycle through red, green, blue. Mixed colors cycles through rainbow colors. Pick the controller type you like. When you're trying to observe that everything is the correct color orientation, I recommend like an ABC all. And then the left-hand side represents what do I want to test. So I can either test by channel number, but I don't know where that is. I'm going to recommend using the Models tab and the Controllers tab. So on the Models tab, it lists my specific models. So if I put a check mark here on my Spiral X, if I've done my job, that Spiral X and this camera, by the way, has a little delay. So I said test Spiral X, and that's what's lighting up. If something different lit up, or if I had different outcome than what I turned on, then I still got a misconfiguration somewhere in the chain of events, whether it's a controller configuration. If you haven't done upload outputs recently, do an upload output that will configure the controller for you based upon what you've defined within the visualizer. So I can turn that test off, and the tree will go dark. It is a little bit delay. That's an example of the red, green, blue. But now we're turning on like my star left and see, now I would expect just the star to light up. And now it's just going through a rainbow cycle as opposed to the individual RGB blue. Personally, I find that a little more pleasing to the eye. And then okay, so star's working right, and then tree's working right. It means my models, my channel assignments, my controller config, everything kind of all lines up. Cool. Controllers testing. So that's picking model by model by model. So when you light up a model, that model and only that model should light up. If you get different result, then we'll then continue on the path and troubleshooting. This isn't really a troubleshooting class, but like with every class, we're going to do a degree of troubleshooting. So I'm going to expand my F16 controller. You can see these little arrows. Now I can turn the entire controller on, or I can scroll down. You'll see these unavailable ports because I just don't have any models configured for those ports in this layout. But you know, my port 21 I did. When I expand that, I can see Smart Remote A and B, and I can see the models. So if I keep expanding, I can even go to the individual nodes. So I can say turn on just these first 3 nodes of that tree. And if I look at the camera, I can see that those first 3 nodes are lit up. So you can get to individual pixels. But one thing I use here, whether I'm dealing with smart remotes, is I hit smart remote A, and then everything I expect to be on A should be lit up. And that's the left tree. Yep, yeah, everything on A is lighting up. And then if I say smart remote B, it should light up all of the models on smart remote B, and that should only light up B. So I must have done something right in my configuration. Another great advantage here in the testing, since we're here, I want to take the Spiral X and expand it. Not from the controller. So from the controller, I can still do individual nodes, but I'm going to jump back to the models tab, Spiral X expand. So if I have a model that has submodels, I can turn on just that individual submodel. And it helps to make sure, yeah, that looks like spiral. So I got the right wiring, because sometimes we mess up on wiring, believe me. And I can turn on like individual balls. Yeah, I have what I need. Yeah, that's exactly what I expect. So I've used this a lot to find, like wiring issues on models with submodels. And if I go do spiral big or spiral in star, actually, and then, yep, that gives me what I need. So if that does not give you the output you need, then it's possible you may have a wiring difference between the way the model is defined in xLights versus your physical wiring. So great little test tools. Also on the model tab, I can pick, and here I can use my mouse and I can highlight and drag certain pixels and turn them on. And then only those pixels turn on. So this is really good troubleshooting to help. Is everything right as I expect? So I just did that little band and those should turn on. So yep, everything lines up with what I want. To turn these off, you hold down Shift and then drag and it turns them off. So just click and drag to highlight specific. You can zoom in and out and then Shift drag to turn off pixels in that testing. All right, so enough testing. Everything seems to line up. I got my infamous little sequence here, a little animation sequence of butterfly. I created this mini trees group that just contains the green tree submodel for the Spiral X and this tree. And if I output to lights, you should see the bars effect go across the trees. And you can see my alignment even is working. So like as that red, and I know this camera is a crappy old antique camera. It doesn't have great focus, but anyway, gets the job done. Especially when you're shining a bunch of LED light at it, it like tends to wash out. So that's the configuring of in Visualizer, turn off output to lights, go to Visualizer, configuring how to do smart remotes, right? Add the model to the ports based upon where you have your RJ45 cable plugged into your controller. Right click, smart remote, define the remote. Remember in the presentation, we talked a little bit about these multi-string models, right? So I got this big tree that's 16 pixels, and I want to plug him onto a receiver that's on port 17 through 20. So I'm dragging him over onto port 17. Well, what just happened, right? Because he's 16 strings, automatically he's going to try to take the next 16 ports. And you notice you have errors down here. Visualizer is great about giving you warnings or errors. If you have anything in this lower dialog box, please pay attention to what it is. Depending on the specific warning, it may be intentional, so you can leave that, but certainly any errors will likely prevent you from uploading. And this is basically just telling us I have things assigned to port 21 through 24 that are both white, which is not a smart remote, and then green, which is a smart remote. Well, that's just because it's not configured right. So smart remote, we're going to start on A. All right, now I got 16 ports on A, but they're all in the green box, but they're just going straight down. All right, well, now this is where I need to cascade, right? Because I'm going to do this on an SRX4. I don't have this tree physically plugged in or anything, so you can't look at it in the camera. But I remember about cascade ports. So when I have a multi-string model that goes across multiple smart remotes, A, B, C, D in this case, I want to cascade down 4 remotes. And boom, it just now figured that out and automatically assigned this as cascaded. So it's smart type and it automatically figured out. Remember, string 1 is going to be on A1, which technically is 17A. Then string 2 will be the second port on the A receiver, third port, fourth port. Then this will be the first port on the B receiver, second, third, fourth on the B, string 8, then 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So that's how you would configure a multi-string model on, I'm just going to go ahead and push that upload to the controller, and then we'll actually jump to the control. I don't have that controller page open. And if I go to output, pixel outputs, you can see how that configures. I got 17A through 20A at 200 pixels each, string 1, 2, 3, 4. Then it automatically created the B, 17 through 20B. It's 200 pixels each, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then here's the 21A with my tree. I actually drug something in it, like populated a link in there, which was not supposed to. Let me refresh that page. Yes, reload site. I did not intend to make that change. I'm not using my standard mouse. I'm using a different mouse with where I'm at right now. So sorry about the extra little mousey clicks. And you can see that 21B, because that's where I've got it plugged in on the controller, is 21 through 24. And it's on the B receiver, which is the fifth port on that receiver, because it's an SRX2. And I got the 450 for the Spiral X. So you can see how that configured. The last element that I'll go ahead and demonstrate live here is on a Cope controller. Again, this is not in camera view, so we won't see it live, but let me just go to its visualizer. And let's presume I've got a smart remote on port 9 on this particular guy, and it's maybe grabbing a single line onto port 9. And I had set that to C earlier, so it might remember that. When you make these changes, when you make these smart remote settings, technically what's happening is it's assigning an attribute to the model. So if I just drag the model off and drag it back on again, it's going to remember if it had previous settings, it'll kind of remember those. So we saw it come over on the C because we used the same model to demonstrate C earlier. So once I have this configured and it's going to be on the A receiver, I would right click and choose Smart Remote Type. And I would choose the appropriate type, whether I got a V2 protocol type receiver, which is going to be all modern receivers over the last several years, or if I've got one of the older V1 receivers. Remember the V1 receivers are these more rectangular, not the square, but these more rectangular V1 type receivers. You can either set that at the port, which will assign all models, or you technically could do that at the smart remote type. If I'm on like my Falcon or a Genius controller, I won't see those options. So if I come down here and select that port, I don't have smart remote type available because it's not available on that controller type. So the rules of this available in Visualizer are dependent upon the particular controller type that you have selected. I think that's all I kind of got for tonight. I know that puts us right at like the hour anyway, but I'd like to open up for anybody have any questions or anything specific or specific quick things we'd like to cover in related to differential receivers.
You can unmute if you have a question. You can just holler it out or raise your hand in question. Stevie, I saw you had some questions in chat. Do you have any other? Need any clarification on that?
So it sounds like others were kind of answering in there. So I'll go back.
Yeah,
I
they were
told
answering. I just
the
wonder if you
power
needed it.
supply. So yeah, receivers will be on their own power supply because they're usually going to be in a remote location away from your controller, right?
Yeah, the question I was asking was since I'm not going to chain them, I can leave them set to zero, correct?
Correct. Yep.
And,
So our
and
recommendation is to ease the complexity. So technically you could do either, but our recommendation to make it less complex, if you're only going to do a single receiver on a chain, just leave it at zero. Make sure your terminator is set to on and treat it as a normal mode. Do not configure smart remote types in Visualizer. Make sure your models are white, not colored.
all right, but I do have a couple that are going to be SRX2,
Yeah, they
uh,
have to be smart type because that's technically that is two receivers.
yeah, A and B. Yep.
Correct, correct. So make sure that dial is set to A.
Okay.
If it's going to be on its own, like port from the controller, I'm assuming it's going to be the only receiver on there, that SRX2. So I would set that dial to A. And then the ports that are in the ID box that's labeled ID would be the A ports, and the one that's labeled ID plus one would be the B ports.
Gotcha.
Yeah, great questions there. Yeah. Colt smart receiver with Cat 5 versus a K2 over Wi-Fi to reach a prop 50 foot away. Pros and cons. Yeah. Do you prefer Toyota or Honda or Chevy or Ford? Um, I do both. A K2, I'm assuming you're talking about like the little two-port pi cap, right? That's another instance of FPP. It's another thing to get upgraded. It's another thing to do whatever. If you can get an RJ40 Cat5 cable or RJ45 cable from the controller to receiver location, that is going to give you is still a single point of management. You're managing it at that controller, right? And instead of multiple controllers. If you're already doing multiple controllers, then there's no harm in doing a K2. If you do deploy that with Wi-Fi, just make sure that it's in remote mode and using multi-sync. And so when you upload sequences, you have to upload sequences to it as well. So that way he's just getting the sync packets and playing his own version of the sequence. Um, so it's really kind of personal choice based upon your specific layout and how you can get there. Sometimes getting a Cat5 cable from a controller to receiver location is super easy and just next and done. Other times that's more of a logistical headache, right? And Wi-Fi out in the yard, right? So if you're doing a K2 over Wi-Fi, like you talk about there, Lionel, it um it's going to be really dependent upon your Wi-Fi coverage in the area you need to deploy that to. Yeah, and one of the charity shows I kind of cooperate has like 21 controllers in it. And last year we actually only ran 17 controllers because we started to increase our receiver count and and I've been trying to, move more towards receivers loads. If I'm running a RJ45 cable anyway, just move more towards receivers. And Lex complex, Martin hits the nail on the head. Lex complexity, simpler troubleshooting. So, uploading sequences to, 17, 18, 20 controllers is a little bit more complex and time consuming than uploading to 3 or 4 controllers. So been kind of moving those to minimize the control points. And when upgrading, how many do I have to upgrade? We've been moving more towards receivers out there. And they're almost all in normal mode. Almost all of the receivers we have deployed out there are in normal mode with dial set to zero. That's my preference just for ease of less complexity. And then we do have a couple like you was that I'm sorry, Stevie. They had the SRX2. So we have a couple models that are like 6 ports. So I deployed an SRX2 there instead of running multiple Cat5 cables to run multiple 4 ports. I deployed a couple of SRX2s for those models.
That's sort of how I've got mine mapped out. I've got three, four F-16 V5s and
Mm-hmm.
trying to strategically place them to where about every prop's going to be on a port to eliminate a lot of power injection and power and other problems, I think.
Yep. Yeah, especially if your show's kind of spread out and you have distance between models or whatever. And like this particular cherry show I mentioned is like over an entire empty lot on the end of a road right off a roundabout. And so it's pretty spread out space wise.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of not a lot of big port count controllers other than the two megatrees. But we do a lot of distributed receivers and distributed controllers just to kind of have the controller closer to the props. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's all I have now. Uh, I'll defer back to Andy if there's any
Okay.
other specific question.
No,
Tom,
the next
before
question is not related, so
Ray
we'll get to
runs
that
one
once we
question.
stop.
Yeah, we can get into that question in a
Yep.
moment. Yeah. So appreciate everyone's time.
Yep.
Thanks for coming in. If you have any, questions, don't hesitate to come back to the Zoom room in here. And there's plenty of the helpers in here. They have quite a bit of experience, knowledge on smart receivers. They'll be glad to get you sorted out.
Thank you, Ron. Another great presentation. Thanks, everyone.